A Girl in Every Port, written and narrated by Ian Riddle. This is the first in a suite of 6 short stories collectively called The Times Challenge. It was first published in Collected Writings, Ian Riddle, Volume 2. Between January 13th and February 17th, 2019, the Times newspapers published 6 photographs from its archives in the Sunday Times editions. Each photograph was accompanied by a short story written by Alexander McCall Smith. The Sunday Times then challenged its readers to submit stories with their own interpretation of the pictures. Readers' stories were limited to a maximum of 1,000 words each. The first picture shows the back view of a young woman sitting at the foot of a sphinx. She appears to be writing. A river flows to the right-hand side of her. Agnes had loved the docks right from a little girl. It was where she was born, where she'd grown up. She'd spent all the time she could there, watching the ships come and go, craning her neck back to see them being loaded and unloaded. There was always something happening, something to interest, to excite, to feed her imagination, and Agnes was a girl with a vivid imagination. In her mind, she saw all the faraway places that those ships had sailed to and the cargoes they carried. Later on, as Agnes grew older, there was also the attraction of some burly young sailors to be considered as well. Agnes came to have a penchant for the seafaring type. One such sailor was Douglas Green, most definitely a bit of a sea dog, who'd sailed to London out of New York on the Florence. Douglas was a strapping fellow with rugged, good looks and spoke with a southern drawl. He was most definitely a ladies' man and a charmer. Agnes wasn't the first girl who'd swooned at the sight of him. By the time that Agnes met Douglas, she was in her early 20s and working in London itself, away from the docks, and she shared lodgings with a group of young women, all of them a similar age. Agnes's days were filled with her work and her free time in going about with this new group of friends. She no longer visited the docks as she used to, although she still retained her love of the water, along with all the attendant romanticism it held for her. In a nod to her past, Agnes would often sit at the foot of the Sphinx on the embankment, watching the Thames' steady flow towards the sea. In her mind, she saw it rolling past her docks, taking her ships out with it, whilst the incoming tides brought others home. The Sphinx became one of Agnes's favourite haunts at that time. That first night, after the Florence had docked, the crew, all scrubbed and brushed, had gone into town looking for fun and relaxation. By chance, they'd bumped into Agnes and her friends. Together, the 2 groups combined and made a night of it. Agnes and Douglas immediately gelled. It was as if they'd known each other all their lives, despite the fact that, from beginning to end, it was only a matter of 2 weeks. They saw each other every night. It was also very whirlwind, all such a dream, particularly to a girl prone to a certain level of romanticism, as Agnes was. On the spur, Douglas asked her to marry him, temporarily forgetting the wife back home. He said the captain could do it, and without hesitation, Agnes said yes. They went on board the ship the night before it was due to sail, and would have parted till dawn had it not been for the fact that the ship had to catch an early tide. There wasn't even time to consummate the marriage. It was merely a kiss and goodbye. Douglas has said that he had to sail back to New York to complete his contract, but that he'd return within a month. Once back, they'd find a home together, and from then on he'd sail out of London and on shorter sailings too. Agnes believed and waited. When the time came for the Florence to return, Agnes was at the docks as it anchored, all ready to greet the ship and her sailor husband home. She was very surprised then, to say the least, when she discovered that Douglas wasn't on board. She asked one of the crew she'd remembered from before, Ezra, where he was. Had something happened? Ezra somewhat sheepishly said that he didn't know too much. If he did, he certainly wasn't telling, other than the fact that they'd returned to New York, and after a week there, Douglas had shipped to Panama. Agnes was dumbstruck. This wasn't supposed to have happened. Douglas should have been home with her by then. At first, she visited the harbour regularly and checked with the Florence each time she was in port. But as time went by and there was no sighting of him, the time span between visits widened until they stopped altogether. Agnes had to accept that Douglas wasn't returning. Ever. 2 years on, exactly from that wedding day, the day that should have been their anniversary, Agnes sat in her once favourite spot at the foot of the Sphinx and looked out over the Thames again. She hadn't visited for some time, certainly not in recent months, for by then Agnes had had the mass of her romantic notions ripped away by harsh reality. Agnes took a piece of paper and a pencil from her bag. Leaning on the Sphinx's foot, she wrote a short but poignant note, wishing whoever found her wedding ring to take it with her blessing. She herself had no further use for it. Douglas was dead to her, one way or another. She hoped that it might bring the finder better favour than it had her. Agnes rolled the note into a loose cylinder and put her ring around it to hold it fast. Then she put the both of them, ring and note, into a bottle, fitted the stopper tight, and with as hard a throw as she could muster, flung the bottle and its contents into the waters, leaving them to chance and fate. Just as Agnes was flinging the bottle, somewhere far away in the warmth of the South China Seas, on a clear moonlit night, a couple were getting married. The setting couldn't have been more idyllic if it had tried. I do love a good wedding, thought the groom, smiling at his bride, especially my own. And so, of course, he should, for that night Douglas Green was marrying his fourth wife.